Good evening. Call to order the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, July 25th, 2018. If we could have the roll call, please.
Atkins. Here. Arnson. Giarusso.
Here.
Hartley.
Here.
Holst.
Here.
Leeper. Oberly.
Here.
Saul.
Here.
Here.
Thank you. Move on to approval of the minutes from our July 11th commission meeting. Are there any comments or corrections? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Those in favor of approval of the minutes signify with aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Thank you. Our minutes are approved. At this point, we'll open the floor for any general public comments. And seeing none, we'll move on to our further agenda items. Next on the agenda are public hearings. We have two public hearing items this evening. The first is a zoning ordinance. This is the Central Business District overlay amendments. And Ms. Lehman, if you would introduce this for us, please.
Thank you. So before I go into detail about the proposed changes that we're going to have presenting to you today, I wanted to go in a little bit of background about what the overlay is and also how we got to this point. So back in 2002, the original design guidelines were established by Community Main Street for their downtown corridor. In 2004, the Central Business District overlay was first established. The boundary of the overlay runs from the river south to 7th Street and then west from the river to Franklin Street. The overlay requires that all substantial improvements to exterior of the buildings in that district go through a public review process, so through planning and zoning as well as council. So that overlay also provides design standards for proposed substantial improvements that would complement downtown retail and encourage multifamily or multifunctional and walkable environments. So there are really two goals to the code amendments we're proposing today. One would be to clarify the design review process that we have in place already, specifically Community Main Street's role in the process. And two would be to provide standards that are more clear and objective. And really there are four reasons for that. One being that there's always consistency in our reviews. Two, that there's a clear vision of what type of development we'd like to see in our downtown. And then two, that both developers and the public know what to expect from projects as they come forward. So really quickly, just a quick outline of what you'll see on the next few slides here. So I went over some background on the overlay district itself, but I'll give you some background on how we are, where we are today in terms of our proposed changes. Then I'll go into the site plan review process as it is today and how we're looking to move it forward, with your approval, of course. And then also going from there to the proposed code changes, kind of delving into that step by step, and at the end, kind of summarizing it in a timeline of what to expect and when potentially these ordinances could be put into place. So there have been a number of projects that have gone through our site plan review process over the past few years that have raised concerns from staff, the public, and City Council. Specifically, that our code that we have in place is too subjective and open to interpretation, as well as Community Main Street's role in the review process was unclear. So to address these concerns, City staff has met with the Community Main Street Design Committee regularly since 2017 to come up with a solution. At these meetings, we discussed multiple community design standards and the direction that we wanted to go with our design code. So following these discussions, the Design Committee updated their design guidelines, focusing really on best practices. So with those guidelines and Community Main Street's input, staff put together code revision for our Central Business District overlay. We have introduced the item at P&Z on January 24th, 2018, and then again on April 12th updated you on our progress. So with those comments and continuing to work with Community Main Street, we have revisions here and hopefully a final draft that we can recommend for approval and moving on to City Council. So through our discussions, it was made clear that we needed to come up with a clear vision of what we wanted our downtown to become and how we wanted it to grow. So there are a number of categories that need to be considered when it comes to that type of visioning, and that really requires a larger and more broader community discussion specific to our community and specific to our downtown area. However, to keep the process moving and to really make it manageable, we decided to kind of take it step by step, chunk by chunk, just so that from a staff perspective, from a community perspective, you can really follow through and swallow the material and kind of really understand each part of it as we move forward. So the focus of today's proposed code changes are on design, specifically new storefront design. We will not be delving into height or parking. However, these are very, very important aspects of downtown as we grow and how we develop. So we do know this, and we do want to go into further discussion on these two topics in the future. So pay attention. We're hoping to have some public discussions on that coming up here. But again, today, really just focusing on design, specifically storefront design. So until this point, Community Main Street's Design Committee has been working directly with applicants and giving their feedback and recommendations to staff prior to or really during the staff review process. However, this practice has given the impression that Community Main Street is an authority in the review process, which is not and has not been the case. Community Main Street is and wishes to be seen as a resource for the community and potential developers in the area. So to enforce their role as a resource to the community, their role needed to be clearly defined in the code and the process outlined. So staff will still encourage applicants to seek Community Main Street expertise, but for the official review process, Community Main Street will be treated like any other public member or organization. So they will only officially provide feedback to the city on designs at the time of the public hearing. So at P&Z, for instance, or city council, just like any other citizen or other entity would. This makes sure that the process is transparent and that Community Main Street is not mistaken as an authority. So I have made the drafted changes available to you to look through and follow along if you would like, as I go through the next few slides. If you're watching on TV, this is available online at cedarfalls.com. And if you go to our website, it's on our planning and zoning page for the meeting today under meeting materials. So feel free to click that, download it, and follow along too in that way if you'd like. The changes are noted in red font, and then added language is underlined. Strike-through notation indicates language that has been or proposing to delete. I will not be going through each change in the document, as a lot of what you will see just clarifies certain points. We're not changing the intent at all, and really cleans up the language, and really looking to make it more reader-friendly. So in this presentation, I will highlight the changes that would impact the design of a building and show examples of what those changes would mean. A lot of these changes that we will discuss are already things that Community Main Street and staff have encouraged developers and really held them accountable to in the past, as they are best practices. They just never really haven't been put in the code specifically, but a lot of this will not be new to you. And for essence of time, I was originally going to stop, but we'll keep going and save questions for. So for the first section I'd like to discuss is on page 3, item F, if you'd like to follow along, and that's specifically applicability. So the way the code is written now, everything that qualifies as a substantial improvement, which again is changes to the exterior of a building within the overlay, goes through the public review process. So again, planning and zoning and through city council. This process will remain the same. Projects that are not required to go through the review are outlined here as well as in the code. The only change we are proposing is in red on this slide. We are proposing to expand the exceptions to also include other existing smaller, purely residential units, so up to seven units. And again, these are purely residential units, so mixed-use building with 1 unit above would still be triggered to go through this review process. And then just so you know, that really would trigger 10 properties, existing duplexes, and I think there's a 5-plex and a 6-plex that are in the outskirts of the downtown. So these properties would not be triggered if they're doing a change to the property to this review process. So it was felt both by staff and Community Main Street that it wasn't necessary to make them go through if they wanted to change some windows or replace their roof or do something like that. But then, just to clarify, any new single-family home or new duplex would be triggered. So it's purely for existing smaller units, residential units in the overlay. The next proposed change is on page 3, item H, in terms of front yard setbacks. Setbacks is a term that addresses where a building can be placed on a lot. And it's really determined by the zoning district that a property is located in. So in the central business district, there are a number of zoning districts that would be applicable. And they're shown here on this map. It's a little small, but we have R3, C1, C2, C3, and M2, so residential, commercial, and even industrial. So as it is now, front yard setback, again, that's how close a building could be placed to the sidewalk. In the C2, C3, and M2 zoning districts is 0 feet, so you can build right up to the sidewalk. In R3, C1, and M2 zoning, however, there's a 25-foot front yard setback. So that would mean if you built a new building, you'd have to move it back 25 feet. So we really wish to encourage the Main Street character throughout the district in these zoning districts throughout the overlay. And as you will notice, as most older places in town, a lot of the older buildings are actually built up a lot closer than what our current code permits. So to really emphasize that character and encourage that character in our downtown, we're proposing that all new commercial buildings and expansions can have a front yard setback of 0 to 10 feet. So that would mean that properties in the C1 and M2 could move closer to the property line and close to the sidewalk, and that residential setbacks be brought from 25 feet to 10 feet. So again, allowing for them to come closer but still have a front yard, to really foster that residential, but also to allow for more flexibility and really, for these smaller lots, allow it to be better utilized. So here's an example of what that would mean visually. So on one side, you have properties that are built up right to the property line, so right to the sidewalk, fostering really a walkable environment that's inviting part of it, kind of walking through that area. On the other side, you have properties that have that 25-foot setback. What really you see is that's utilized for parking spaces. So really, again, we're looking to emphasize that walkability, that downtown feel by having properties closer to the property line to make it more accessible and pedestrian friendly. So the next section that we're proposing changes to is on page 4, item 4, building composition. So this section really looks at a building as it's physically composed, and it looks at ways to make a building visually interesting and really break up long building walls. The way you do this is by creating vertical breaks in the building, and that can be done through bays, and that can be done through windows or breaks in the wall plane, or even setting the plane back in that sense. We also are looking in this section to emphasize the storefront, so really drawing the eye and the attention. Oh, the yellow's not showing up that well, but really drawing the attention of people walking by, and the emphasis of the building should be the storefront, that base floor of the building. So the code really emphasizes and would encourage those practices. Again, standard best practices that you'll see in other design codes as well. So here's an example of what that would look like on an older building in our downtown, and then newer building. So again, drawing emphasis on the storefront level, and then having that broken up planes of making longer wall spaces feel more accessible and more walker friendly in that sense of breaking that up, making it more visually interesting. The last element to the composition is the height of the first floor of a commercial or mixed-use building. So in the code, we're proposing to implement a 14-foot minimum floor to roof or ceiling, I guess, height. And that's really a best practice that we've taken from multiple communities and from actually real estate agents. So what we found is that you need a minimum of 14 feet to allow for a wide variety of commercial uses to occupy a space. And really in our market today, you really need that 14 feet to make it marketable and competitive. So most, if not all, of our buildings in the downtown have or exceed this 14-foot minimum. Here are examples of two newly approved properties that we have moving forward, one with a minimum floor height of 16 and the other one of 18. So again, meeting our 14 standards. So pretty common height there. So before I move on to the other nitty-gritty section parts of the code, we needed to define two terms just for clarity. So that's the other code amendment we're proposing, 29-2 definitions. And really all we're doing is adding the definition of facade and storefront to the code. So facade means the entire exterior wall of a building along a street, which includes all stories. So here in this image, you'll see that red image, base to top, that's the facade, the entire building there along the street. The storefront specifically means the area of the facade at ground level. So that really the store base of the building typically is the first 15 feet. So the next change is for windows and transparency, and that's on page 5, item 5. So this section is very important to the proposed code, and again, following best practices that we've seen and have currently in our downtown. And this section really is pushing towards having clear and transparent windows on the base of buildings that invite views of the interior of a store, and you really need this for a pedestrian-friendly shopping environment. So in this section, we would want lots of windows on the building focused on at the pedestrian level, which is 2 and 10 feet, generally is where you'd like to see that. So the code is proposing that within those 2 to 10 feet, we would like to see 70% at minimum be glass or be transparent so that you can really have that storefront shopping walkable experience. So what does that mean in terms of what we have and what will be proposed? So here's an example of one of my favorite stores in the downtown, Scratch at 315 Main Street. And if you look at it, it's a little hard to see, but the red box indicates 2 to 10 feet. So that's the area that we're considering in this code amendment. The yellow being the areas that are transparent glass. So in this case, 76% of this facade, of this bottom facade portion is glass. So it does meet our standards. So that's an example of what that could look like. And those who are wondering, these are technically, this blue area here, there's technically glass, just the tables are pushed up against it. So that's something interior, but that is counted toward that glass count. Here's an example, so meet standards. So here's an example of a recent building that has gone through the process. And again, you have the red box showing the 2 to 10 feet. You have the yellow kind of circled area showing what we would consider in that calculation. And this would be 87% glass. So this also meets the 70% minimum we'd like to see along the storefront area. So again, emphasizing that this is, again, a common practice, and most, if not all, buildings meet this already. So again, kind of encouraging that best practice in our code. Meet standards. So the next section is item 6 on page 5. And this really looks at materials and textures. So we are really looking to promote higher quality materials, specifically brick, stone, and terracotta in our buildings downtown. So really looking to promote at the base of the building, really again where that shopper experience is. So we're looking to have 50% of the entire facade, again the entire building top to bottom, be one of those materials, brick, stone, or terracotta. And that 35 or 25% of a side or rear be of that material as well. However, we still want to promote variation and allow for other materials to be used. So 35% of any other material could also be used on that facade, so metal, painted wood, etc. So here's an example of an existing building, and we would consider this to be 100% brick. So we would not be including those windows in these calculations. So the entire facade, in this case, would be seen as brick. So again, something that we looked at best practices. In this section, we're also looking to encourage certain types of material at certain parts of the building. So for instance, you wouldn't want metal at the base of the building. It dents easily, is damaged easily over time. So that's something you'd want higher up from a maintenance standpoint. So here's an example of something that would not meet our standards. But this is something, if approved. This is a recent project that's gone through, and it's a great project. However, if it went through after these amendments, if approved, they would have to make some changes. So the entire building, the two blocks, is about 26% brick, as it is. However, just looking at that, the left side of the building, that is 52% brick. So there's about 48% metal here. So again, great design, but if it came through under these variations, it would mean more brick, and it would mean more material interest or differences in the above floors. So the question came up, well, let's say they wanted to go through and make some changes to the building. Would they be triggered and have to update the entire building to meet these current standards? It is not the case. You just couldn't move further away from it. So you could replace like with like. So again, these changes are really only going towards additions and new construction altogether. So building like this would not have to update to these standards. The next section is page 6, item 7, color. So we really try to emphasize what we have in the downtown already and what we'd like to see. So earth tones and neutral tones. And here are some examples, again, just examples of what those colors are. So kind of more muted, but at the same time, you can still have multiple colors in the district. However, we do want to encourage other colors as well. So here are some examples of some brighter colors that would not fall under the earth tone or neutral tone, definition. However, you could use them as an accent. So we said about 15%. That's usually what you see in the trim and other areas. And really, this is a best practice. You want a business's, logo or emblem or their style really to be represented in their signage, not necessarily in the building itself. So that's just something that we added for, again, that objectivity, for clarity of projects. On page 6, item 9, we talk about building entry, and really this is, again, best practices. A building should be accessible from the primary street. A door to any residential unit is easily accessible and visible, and really the point of that being, we don't have this problem as much here, but you don't want the only entrance to an apartment that's upstairs off the alley or on the back where there's no lighting, where it's dangerous, and those are often in the bigger cities, prime mugging locations. So you want it to be safe and accessible, but you want it to be visible and for them to feel safe and for it to be seen. Longer buildings should have multiple entrances, so you don't have one long wall with nothing to get into. So again, having those breaks. The main entry should be at the level of the sidewalk so that it's accessible to everybody. And that really the entrance should be prominent so that people know where to enter and that the entrance to the building is kind of where your eye goes and where you want to go. So really focusing on safe, accessible, and pedestrian-friendly. So the signage section has a lot of changes in it, has lots of red, but there's really only 3 things that we're proposing to change. The other ones are things that we took from other parts of the code and putting it all in the same place. Before I think there were 3 other sections you had to refer to find all the code signage sections that would be applicable for the downtown. So most of that's just copy and pasted from other sections. So the 3 changes that we're proposing here is the addition of the potential use of a blade sign. The blade sign is basically a smaller type of projecting sign that can be closer to the sidewalk, but it's of course a lot smaller. I think it's limited to 3 or 4 feet. But the idea being, it's really for the pedestrians, and that's something cool that we've seen, and we've seen a lot of interest in, and so we want to be able to encourage and use that. The next one is window signs into film, and that really kind of piggybacks off our windows and transparency section. Again, we want that visible transparency through the window, so you don't want to clutter it too much with window signs or film. You want to keep that open and visible to individuals. The last one being wall signs. So currently our code allows really any business to have up to 33%, a third of their wall be a wall sign or use wall signs. So that's a lot, and most, if not any building very rarely gets close to that level. So we wanted to kind of take a step back and bring it more down, in the downtown where design is more prominent to a more reasonable amount. So we're proposing 10%, and actually that's a lot higher than what most other communities allow. So we're still allowing flexibility, but trying to taper it back. We really don't want a third of the building being wall signage. The last section is on page 8, item L. And it's exceptions. So we understand that these guidelines can be restrictive, if not impossible, for certain locations, or if you're wanting to rehab a building per se and use it for something else. So for instance, bike tech is a great example. We want projects like this to happen and we encourage it. So we want to have a section that would allow something like this to come forward and to happen. So basically including that flexibility for unique cases such as smaller corner lots or older buildings that weren't necessarily designed as commercial storefronts. So just a tentative timeline of kind of what it could look like. So we had a meeting with downtown stakeholders on June 26th, which went really well. And then today, of course, we have our public hearing and potential vote. And if it's passed today, it would move to committee of a whole on August 6th, where we would present the proposed changes and any suggestions you would have to council and get their response. And then from there, hopefully go to set public hearing and then have the first reading on the 3rd, the second reading on the 17th, and then adoption would occur on October 1st. So that's the general timeline. So it always takes a little bit of time. But with that, are there any questions that I can answer, or concerns or suggestions?
Just one, I guess, Iris. Thanks for all the hard work. There's a lot you put into this, so and I think it's all very good. The one thing that I would maybe not agree with totally is on page 4 under the building composition, using that figure 2. The requirement that at every 60 feet you have to have a 2-foot by 10-foot minimum setback doesn't seem as consistent with, with your typical downtown. I wonder if that could have the setback would only require it at the storefront level, which would be typical, downtown. I mean, a lot of times you have, your recesses at your entry, but it doesn't run the full vertical height. If you go down Main Street right now, I mean, I can't think of an example anywhere where there would be a full recess of the storefront that goes, 2 or 3 stories up. And so, if you're filling in something else and all of a sudden we're requiring that on the upper stories, that doesn't seem as consistent with the downtown. And that's the one detail thing I noticed.
So, I can help respond to that.
I think the idea is with new buildings, so in a traditional downtown, you have a lot of smaller buildings there's a rhythm, and the storefront, the buildings themselves create that sort of articulation. And what this is trying to create is that same sort of feeling of Main Street building. A lot of the Main Street buildings are probably less than 60 feet wide. They're 25 feet wide.
You get
40
your
feet
standard
wide.
kind of 20-foot bays, and a lot of them are 20 or 40 or whatever.
Right, and so this is intended, if you have like a whole block length,
Right.
it goes through, that there's some nod toward that breaking up those into modules,
Yeah.
into that modulation and articulation of the facade. And I think if you went to, maybe there's some photos of the Main Street.
But I guess, my thinking was, I mean, you're already requiring in there that every 20 to 40 feet there's vertical breakups anyways.
Okay, go back
So
to,
just mandating a total recess, I wonder if that's really necessary if you're already, calling for that kind of, because if somebody's just doing a 40-foot building, that doesn't, even if it's a 40-foot by a 40-foot, you're not going to make them do it because it's 60 feet total. It's just every individual, right? Yeah.
right, so if it's only 40 feet wide, it wouldn't be required.
Right,
Right,
right.
so, but if it's more than 60 feet, you'd have to have one break in the facade. So sometimes we've seen the standard be like 100 feet, and you'd have to break it at least once every 100. I mean, it could be a lot of different things, but I think the concern, I mean, here you can see the older buildings, it gives a visual of that break. Now, it might not be a 2-foot recess, but it's really talking about the upper floors, not necessarily the ground level
But
floor.
I was just thinking, because you did say, hey, you can't go more than 40 feet without having some sort of a visual break already. I don't know. I think it's good to have it at the street level, because then there's kind of the in and out, which is pretty typical, for your entries and things like that. It just seemed to me to require it on the upper floors when you're already telling them they got to have some sort of, visual breakup every 20 or 40 feet. This seemed unnecessary. But
And I think it's only every 60 feet, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, but already it's already calling for in the other parts that are modified, no more than 40 feet without a break, right? Isn't that what we had?
So the other standards are, you don't have to have a break in the wall plane.
Right,
So you could just have a change to
It
the
could be
window
materials
pattern,
or
for
whatever, which is-
example.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is like your standard, which my thinking is like the standard downtown. It's like, okay, yeah, I got a 40-foot storefront here, and then the next one is brick, and it's all in the same plane, but it's a different brick, right? So a different color, so
Right,
that's what you're getting a
right.
break.
I think it's an attempt to have a long building wall that's not, doesn't appear to be a Main Street rhythm, then to have more of a Main Street rhythm is what it's intended for.
Okay. Yeah.
So I have a question on the composition materials, and the question is, are the brick look-alike panels allowed? When you talk about brick, I know you talk about cement and,
So I think there's a lot of debate about the thin brick versus the full width brick. And, there's differing opinions on that. It's not fake brick, it's still brick. It's called thin brick, and it's often then installed in panels. So it's a different installation. You don't have a mason laying each brick
right?
in a veneer, a full width. So I think that's up for debate. I think there's a lot of different opinions. I think a lot of newer buildings are using some of that thin brick panels. So I think it's up for discussion. I guess leaving it as brick, and if we need to clarify that, or if we want to leave it open so that, these buildings will still be each reviewed individually, so those questions can come up at the time. What type of brick? Are you using the full width? Are you using thin brick? And how are you installing that? How are you making sure that it's a quality installation, and what's that going to look like? I think some of the installation of the thin brick, what you would see with a thin brick installation, sometimes at the windows, and Marty might be able to comment to this more as an architect, but sometimes you won't see at the windows the full depth of the width of the brick on a full brick. The windows are inset, so you get those shadow lines. So a building sometimes that uses the thin brick will have a flatter appearance than a building with a.
When you can also get kind of some funny joint lines where panels meet and things like that. But sometimes they look really,
Right, and I
very
know
sharp, too,
there's
so.
different types of corner pieces you can put to give the impression of the thicker, the full width brick, so you don't get that veneer appearance. So I guess it's up for a discussion, but
So we're not articulating that, we're not being specific about that.
the change that's proposed is not being specific, but if we want to refine that or clarify that, if you think there should be a specific recommendation one way or the other, I think that's up for discussion.
could you put some language in there maybe that says that the veneer brick or panelized brick can be used subject to, special review or, specific review by the P&Z and council or something to that effect? That would allow for, it's like, okay, it's okay if it's done right, but, it can be kind of so-so. Would that be a reasonable thing to do, maybe?
Seems like a reasonable thing. Another thing we could do is ask for material samples,
Yeah.
so you get so you
Well, it
have
could
an
be part of
idea of
that-
the quality of the
Kind
material.
of have a special approval process for it, just to make sure that it's being done well.
Well, I think the problem with that then is it's all, again, subjective, and I thought the purpose of this was to be more objective, so, if we're going to allow it, we're going to allow it. If we're not, we're not. And, we can't allow it one time and not allow it another time. I suppose we can, but should we? I don't know.
It's probably more about holding it to the idea of this is about quality materials
Right.
and quality installation. So I think those questions are valid to ask about how it's going to be installed and what the quality, what the material is like of the thin brick. Because I'm sure there's lots of variation in the quality of the materials, even within thin brick installations. So.
Yeah, there really are, yeah.
Other comments or questions from the commission? We'll come back to the commission and open it up if there's anyone in the public who would like to address the commission or ask any questions on this item. Please come up. Commission, other discussion?
Do you want to make any
Well, I'll
recommendations?
defer to you because you're the architect and you deal with the materials way, so. I just know what it can look like and what you don't want it to look like.
Right.
But I'll defer to the experts.
Well, one way is just to specifically disallow it, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Is it a material that's used frequently? A thin brick?
Hasn't been so much around here, but that I can think of, but it is out there.
So I guess we will need a motion, depending on how you want to go, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about the vertical height, the recessive 2-foot. I'd like to hear other commission's thought on that, if that's something you would all like to see changed. I think it's a valid point, but I could see it going either way from staff's perspective. It's, again, a common practice we see other places, but is that something we want to see here? I'd love to hear what the other commission members think of Marty's idea.
Are you talking specifically the question that Marty asked?
Yes.
Okay. So I think his comment was more about the upper floors, right?
Correct, yeah, just
Right.
on the upper floors.
So we expect it on the first floor, but on the upper floors, why do we need to have a setback? Is that correct?
That's
When
what
you-
I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah. Because we can do it with aesthetics, we can do it with banding or design changes, right, to make it look like it is? Is that correct?
Yeah, my thought was it's already required in the previous part about breaking it up every 20 to 40 feet visually anyway, so. And since, normally you don't see that on the old downtown part anyways, you just see it at the storefront level normally.
Yeah, I have to agree with Marty on that. The aesthetics is neat when it carries through all the floors, but is that an additional cost in the building process to require that when you could do that with materials to achieve the same effect?
And the other part of that is you're limiting then the square footage of the use of the building as well. So if you have that setback for that full 20 or 40 feet, right? Yeah. I would be inclined to not require that, but require it with aesthetics or with material usage, design-wise.
So is I, the first point under number 4, their building composition, then, is that sufficient for the commission?
Yeah, right, that's what I was talking about. It's
Yeah.
already kind of required there.
So
But-
the suggestion is to eliminate
Just the
II.
requirement. Well, I wouldn't eliminate it, but I would just limit it to the storefront level.
Okay,
So which has already been defined separately, so it'd just be at the storefront level, but not on the upper floors. But it wouldn't restrict somebody from doing that if they wanted to, so if they're designed, just not making them required to do that.
So just to be clear, we got 2 standards here. The first one is under 4 little I, which is visually breaking up the building wall. And that's for the entire building facade, correct?
Yeah.
And then number 2 is the whole point of it was to avoid flat, continuous, and overly long upper floor facades. So that was the purpose of that, was intended to be to break up the upper floor wall. That's the beginning of that sentence. So it gives a maximum length of that wall plane. And in my experience, communities adopt this because they have entire blocks in a main street, and then those new buildings look completely different because they don't have the rhythm of the different storefronts along Main Street. they have one long continuous upper floor wall. So there's different, you
This is
could
really
go
only gonna-
100 feet without a break,
What
which
you're
would give
saying
it a
is
little bit
this
more.
is really only going to apply to very large developments. Because when
Right,
you're basically over 60 feet in length, yeah.
right. But a lot of times those breaks are often used for, if it's upper floors and it's residential, it's a good opportunity, for example, to have, those insets are used for balconies.
Right.
A lot of times they inset the balconies. It's used to create that rhythm on the upper floors that breaks up the building wall. So the other way you could do it is if you think that 2 feet's too much, you could change it to 1 foot, for example, and make it a little less,
I'd be a little more comfortable with that, because I'm just thinking if somebody's developing something and you put a 2-foot chunk there, depending on how they're laying things out, on the inside, it becomes more of an element or more of an issue maybe potentially. But the 1 foot would still give you some articulation, which wouldn't maybe, is not as much depth to be, cause a developer heartburn over what they're being limited on their interior of their building.
And it's not to say that it could be designed with 2 feet. We're just saying we aren't
Right.
going to require
Aren't
it.
gonna
We would
require
require 1 foot.
yeah. I guess, I think staff feels like there should be some articulation of upper floor facade, just for the larger, break up the mass of the building. Because a wall plane change is really going to create that shadow line, that more than any other element that you're trying to change. And usually, even if you're changing materials, you want a little bit of break in the plane, the wall plane.
Yeah. Right, when you get different, going from brick to metal or whatever, you have a
Right.
change in plane,
Right,
or whatever, yeah.
yeah.
So does that satisfy concerns there if the change then is discussed is to reduce from 2 foot to 1 foot the minimum distance?
I think that would be
I'd be okay with that.
I think then we're back to the materials issue. Which is bottom of page 5.
Item 6.
So as it is now, anything that came through would receive review. We'd have a chance to ask for material samples as part of the standard review process.
Yeah, I would have reservations of limiting material used, and then that could just be done in the process of each project, to see the material and review it then.
Do you want to include Mr. Hull's suggestion to have an additional sentence there about thin brick may be considered, but will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, or do you want to just leave it open, or?
I think that's a good idea.
I don't want to call it out because everybody's going to go for thin brick. It's cheaper.
So just leave it as is?
Yeah, either that or just if you want it, if it's questionable, we can just restrict it. I mean, I don't know how often that would come up as something. It's probably going to come up on like a really big building.
Yeah, and I think you could always ask the question during the review process, now that you're thinking about it, when the next building comes forward, you can ask that question, is it a full width brick or is it a thin brick installation?
Yeah.
Because it is being used on a building project downtown right now. And you can distinctly tell the difference. It's on 2 buildings downtown, one, the second River Place MU2 building and the second River Place building. So. I'm okay with leaving it up to review, not calling it out.
Same here.
I agree.
I just had to bring it up.
I think it's good,
Well,
it's a good discussion.
It's a good
Yeah.
point. I mean,
Any other pieces that commission members want to discuss, have questions on, or
No, I think it's a great work, and I know it was a long process, so thank you.
Thank you.
Staff, did we address everything then that was being discussed in?
Yes. So I guess then the next step would be to have a motion to approve the code with the amendment to 4.2, changing the facade for the bays from 2 foot to 1 foot, and then moving it to city council.
I'd make that motion with, just as Iris stated.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second. Go ahead and vote. And we have 6 ayes, yeses on that item, so that is approved, and we'll move on to City Council. Our next agenda item is another public hearing. This continues a previously opened public hearing. This is a rezoning for the southwest corner of Highway 58 and West Ridgeway Avenue. And Ms. Howard, if you would introduce this one.
Okay, we've had a couple meetings on this particular item. This is showing here is the location of this proposed rezoning at the corner of Highway 58 and Ridgeway Avenue. The rezoning is intended to facilitate a redevelopment of the site from agricultural use to a large mixed commercial development. This is a description of the proposed development. Now, this is not a site plan review, this is the rezoning review, but it gives you an idea of what they're proposing. And the site plan will be coming at a future meeting. So with regard to a rezoning, we look to the comprehensive plan, of course, to see what's intended for this particular area. And you can see that this particular property in the comprehensive plan is shown on the future land use map as part of the commercial corridor. So this rezoning would be consistent with the comprehensive plan. It is served with utilities, so that there is sanitary sewer and water available to this site, so it is ripe for redevelopment in that sense. The biggest question that we had, and last time we asked you to continue the public hearing, this rezoning will allow a significant increase in the intensity and variety of the land uses allowed on this property in the future, basically from ag use to commercial development. And we were waiting for the traffic study to be submitted, and the applicant has submitted a traffic impact study. We just received that on Monday. So the staff hasn't had a chance to really review that in full, but it does provide an analysis of the traffic impacts of this development at full build-out and compares these impacts to the projected traffic if this property were not built. So it gives a no-build, a traffic impact study will give a no-build scenario and a full build-out scenario, and then it gives it over a period of time clear till 2040. So it gives a long longitudinal analysis of the projected traffic impacts on the adjacent streets. So we have received that. We haven't had a chance to look at it in detail. Now with the rezoning, any traffic roadway improvements recommended by the study can be included as conditions in a rezoning request. And this is one of the items, is this land ripe for rezoning from ag to commercial development, and access to the property is one of the primary things we look at. Staff believes this is a valuable improvement to the community, this development would be, and so very supportive of redevelopment in this location. But staff is in the process of reviewing that study, and we have also, because it's so important, forwarded it to a third-party traffic engineering firms to provide a peer review of the study to confirm the assumptions and the analysis. And that should be completed in the next several weeks. And staff feels confident that safe access to the property can be provided, but the details and the types of intersections improvements that are needed have yet to be determined. So at this point, staff does recommend approval of the rezoning with the condition that all street, intersection, and traffic control improvements necessary to provide for safe and efficient traffic control and circulation to serve the long-term needs of the development at full build-out without causing undue traffic circulation and congestion problems be agreed upon prior to approval of the rezoning by City Council. This gives a chance to review that study before council then approves the rezoning and to consider the type of intersections. For example, here is a kind of close-up of the different intersections that might be affected with the rezoning and built out of the development. This is proposed to be either a full access point, either signalized intersection or roundabout. The traffic analysis has some figures for both types of intersections, so we need to look at those to see what's best and what functions best not only for this development but for adjacent development as well. And then the second access, they're requesting a right-in, right-out. At this location, it's pretty close to the intersection here, so the idea here was what kind of improvements needed to make that function properly, and how does that affect adjacent surrounding development as well. And then what kinds of improvements are needed at this intersection long-term, perhaps as far as like turn lanes and that sort of thing. So just to give some additional time to review that and determine exactly what's needed, staff is recommending that condition. And then additionally, once that's determined, then prior to issuance of an occupancy permit for the development, those would have to be constructed according to that agreement. The second condition that staff is recommending is that the area shown on the proposed site plan as a future right-of-way on the concept plan remain as open space and should not be developed with any structures, fences, or buildings, hard surfacing driveways, or sidewalks. That's held in future in case there's improvements that the DOT wants to make at that interchange. Thirdly, if and when the property to the west ever redevelops, right to the west, directly to the west right now, there's a mobile home park. But if that were to ever redevelop for commercial uses, that would be similar to this development. We always encourage cross-access easements so that there's not individual driveways. It's just for access control onto our major streets. And so it's just a good practice to have cross-access across commercial developments. So requiring that they identify where that cross-access easement will be at this time. They would not have to construct it right now, but that at the time, if and when this ever redeveloped, that they would construct the driveway to connect to that property. And then that adjacent property would also be required to construct a cross-access to that point so that traffic could flow from one development to the other. And the exact location of the easement will be determined at site plan. I think in the original concept, they had it up here, but there's some potential impacts in the future to the wetlands, and it's a little more difficult crossing here. So the developer is analyzing that, but they believe that maybe they'd shift it further to the south. But we can review that in detail when it gets to the site plan stage. Another condition that staff is recommending is that a 5-foot wide sidewalk shall be installed along the entire frontage of the property along West Ridgeway Avenue. And the city will work with the developer to determine the best location for the easternmost sidewalk segment that's right in here to avoid the wetland. You can see the wetland denoted here, delineated on the concept plan. And so it's a little bit tight here along this portion, but this is a pretty important trail connection. There's sidewalk on the east side of the street here to connect to, and that eventually connects to a regional trail system. So it's a pretty important connection. The city will work with the developer to determine the best location for that easternmost segment, but want to have this as a requirement of the rezoning. Typically, if there's a subdivision, sidewalks are required, and that's part of the requirement. But in this case, they're not subdividing this land right now, so it's important to have this as a condition of the rezoning. Additionally, sidewalks shall be installed throughout the interior of the development site to provide a continuous sidewalk network between all the commercial buildings on the site. And staff is recommending that a sidewalk network plan be required at the time of site plan review. So, for example, we believe that the first 2 portions of the site would be developed with the larger store here and the convenience store or gas station at the corner. But they come up with a plan to show long-term how they're going to provide continuous sidewalk connections throughout all, at full build-out, if there were buildings on each one of these sites, how you would circulate around the site. But at the time, it could be developed in phases, just so long as there's pedestrian connections to all the buildings as they're developed, and between the buildings on the site. So the Community Development Department recommends approval of a conditional rezoning of the subject property from A1 to Highway 1, subject to the conditions outlined in this presentation. And I handed out sort of refined set of conditions that was further refined from the staff report that you received in your packet. So we just worked on that wording just a little bit to get them to function better with the developer and the timing of the project. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any immediate questions for Karen?
I guess I have a question, probably because I'm not as experienced as a commissioner, but is this something that is practice that we put these conditions on when we're changing zoning? Like, are there other properties in Highway 1 that require the sidewalks, and all of that? That's my question.
I think at the time of rezoning is the opportunity for the city, because this is when you're considering whether this property is appropriately upzoned to commercial development. And so these conditions are placed on at the rezoning time because that's when the city is considering whether it's appropriately zoned to commercial. I think that the City of Cedar Falls has not done a lot of conditional zoning agreements. We do have some on the books, but this is something to ensure that it's developed. And I think the other thing here is, once again, we don't have a subdivision, so some of these conditions would occur if there were a subdivision, and we don't have this in this particular case. So we feel that it's important to do that with this rezoning.
So can you give me an example of what other property is zoned Highway 1? Give me an example of one.
That have conditions placed on them?
No, that's zoned Highway 1 now, and what's on it? Do we have other examples?
Everything in that area, like Camping World and,
Camping World, all of that,
yeah,
okay.
Quick
Yeah, I think
Start,
there's
all of that
Highway 1 zoning all along that
whole strip
corridor.
along there.
In fact, the next rezoning on your agenda is Highway 1 as well.
Okay, so that's my question, is that what we're going to now, conditional zoning? Because in other discussions we have C3 rules, there's C3 rules, and there is R4 rules. You know, that's,
So state code allows cities to consider additional conditions that are based on the impacts of a rezoning would have on the community, that are above and beyond the zoning, regular zoning conditions, if it's warranted by the development. Okay. This is a very large development with a significant impact on the traffic in the corridor. So that's why staff felt that it's warranted to have these particular conditions.
okay, thank you.
I want to invite our applicant is Midland Atlantic Development Company, if they're present, if they'd like to speak to the commission.
I believe we find we've enjoyed our work with staff.
Would you mind coming up? Just to get you on the microphone and state your name and address,
John
please.
Silverman, Midland Atlantic Development Company, 8044 Montgomery Road, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45236. We really have nothing to add. The presentation was very complete. We've enjoyed our time working with the staff, and I hope for your support.
And any, you have reviewed then, I hope, the conditions the staff has laid out? And
Yes, ma'am.
able to meet those
Yes, ma'am.
conditions? Thanks. Any other commission, any other questions?
Thank you.
I think, one thing is important, of course, further down our agenda, looking to continue to, I'm sorry. I know this project is important. We want to keep this project rolling forward. I think that the commission has brought up that how important the traffic study is. I think it's really important for us to make sure that staff feels very confident about the bit of a look that you've had at that traffic study, and that you've got enough to work on there. For us, if we were to approve this with the conditions in place, that you feel like you've got enough from that traffic study to meet the city's needs and to be able to address whatever may come out of that in a sensible way.
Yes, I think with these conditions, that it leaves some time for us to review that and get the peer review finished before council considers it. So we have a more definitive notion about what kind of intersections they should be, what's the best for the long-term functioning of that corridor over, not just now or when this is first built, but over the long term for the community. So I think it's important for us to have a chance to review that, but we feel confident that that review will be completed before council consider it.
Well, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward to me because that Highway 1's been what's been planned for that area for a long time. And I think, with these reasonable, which it seems like everybody's agreeable to the conditions to make sure we get the right thing there, I'd make a motion to approve with the staff recommended conditions, the rezoning request.
I will second that motion.
And just to clarify that your approval is for the updated conditions as have been presented to us this evening. Go ahead and vote. We have all ayes on that item, so it is approved, and we'll continue on through the internal review process and on to City Council. We do not have any old business this evening. We'll move on to our new business agenda items. The first is the Highway 1 site plan review for the southeast corner of Highway 58 and Viking Road. And Mr. Sturge.
Thank you, Mrs. Oberly. Yeah, this next project is a new development there at the target, at Viking Plaza subdivision down at the southwest corner of Highway 58 and Green Hill, not Green Hill, but Viking Road. Outlot 1 is in front of the Target store, so it's going to be a new development for a proposed Raising Cane's restaurant. It's a chicken finger restaurant there. The site plan identifies the store right in the middle of the site, along with some other elements. In front of the building, there's an outdoor patio. The front entrance is located on the north and west side of the building. Along Viking Plaza Drive, they will install a sidewalk along the north side of the road, so it'll extend down to the western edge of that property, and then from that point, the sidewalk will continue north along the west bay of those parking stalls. So just to get that pedestrian connection there up to the west side of the building. As part of this Highway 58 project, that existing trail is going to be removed. So that's why we wanted to extend that sidewalk along the south side of Viking Plaza to make that pedestrian connection. So then moving along in that site plan, the dumpsters are located on the south side of the property, and then the drive-through is on the east side of the building. So basically you enter the site near the southeast corner, kind of circulate around the building and enter the drive-through lane on the south side of the building. So the details there, again, it's a 3,300 square foot building. All the parking and building setbacks satisfy the Highway 1 ordinance requirements. Open space and landscaping, they achieve that through those square footages and point schedules. The parking, a little bit more than what we require, but that's what they propose on that. The trash dumpster, again, it's It's at the southwest corner of the site, and it's just basically an 8-foot wall, block wall to match the color and materials of the building. Just again, referring to the Highway 58 interchange project that's underway now at Viking and 58. DOT did purchase a little bit of right-of-way along the north side of the property, along Viking Road, and then Highway 58. And this site is identified, the site is identified here without those right-of-way needs. So this is the current property alignment or the property corners for each site. So basically on the north side and on the west side, there's a 30-foot setback that is clear enough from those existing right-of-way needs. So basically from the end of the Highway 58 project is a 2-year project, and by the end of the year, the construction season, the idea is to open up the northbound side with traffic using the ramps, the new ramps. And then the southbound traffic will basically be reverted to the existing southbound lane. So by the end of the construction season, we'll want to have 2 lanes going north and 2 lanes going south. And then at Viking Road, that'll be a signalized intersection at that time. So that just kind of gets back to when this site is going to be developed here later this summer and fall. We want to kind of coordinate those activities with that project just so we can make sure that that landscaping in those areas will be put in when that project's done. So that's something we may want to hold off in a little later when that 58 and Viking Road project's done. Moving along to the building design, this is kind of their standard building. Got perspectives on the north side and the northeast side of the building. So this is the front door. They have planned patios and outdoor seating area out front. And then there's a large window they kind of want to open up and kind of, it's really not a pass-through, but it's just more of a way to kind of create that attachment between the interior seating area and the outdoor area. The north facade, basically the elements for design materials included, there's just this assorted materials with stucco, painted stucco. There's a brick wainscot down around the building. The windows and the patios are covered by metal canopies, exposed metal canopies. And the wall signage are just identified on the north and west walls. So those signage plans do satisfy the Highway 1 ordinance requirements. There'll just be wall signage on this building. The freestanding sign, they'll plan to utilize the existing Target multi-tenant sign there at Andrea and then down along the south side. So they'll use a tenant panel sign on that for this project. Carrying that design around the back side, the south side, and then the east side, you see the drive-up windows on the east wall. So it just kind of resembles all the way around the building. Those areas with different colors kind of represent kind of a facade, that kind of a relief. It comes out a little bit from that facade. So it is that we talked about for the downtown, a projection there. So it kind of broken up with those surfaces with different colors and materials. So with that, we'd want to move along and recommend approval for this site plan based on the technical requirements on the staff report. Again, getting back to those Highway 58 improvements and other elements on the site plan, and if any other comments that you have from the commission.
At this point, if the applicant is present, if you'd like to come up and address the commission and invite you up. State your name and address, please.
Aaron Miller with CGA Consultants, 5106 Nordic Drive. Our clients has worked with P&Z very well with meeting with their comments and agreed to everything and just ready to move forward. They are aware of the 58 Viking construction. We have put them in communication with PCI, the contractor there, to make sure everything works well.
Any questions for Mr. Miller? Thank you. Commissioners, anyone present who'd like to speak to this item? Commission, any discussion or questions?
Yeah, it's exciting to see that lot get developed out there. I mean, it's a very busy intersection right now, so timing's everything.
Yeah,
I'm not
hopefully
familiar
hopefully
with...
the type of busy changes. Yeah.
I would move Make the motion to move it forward.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to approve. Everybody, we have all eyes on that item. That is approved as well, and we'll move on to City Council. Our next agenda item is the S1 Shopping Center District Redevelopment Plan for 6607 University Avenue, and this is the old Hy-Vee Building. And Mr. Sturge would tell us about this one.
Yes, this is a continued development of the old Hy-Vee Building at 6607 University Avenue, located there at Long Boulder Drive and west of the current Hy-Vee Building. Plans for this development has, started back in 2016 when a developmental agreement was entered between the current property owner and the city. And part of that agreement kind of focused on the development of that parcel, what happens in the building, and the parking area out front. Also, we talk about building remodels, signage, maintenance of those common areas, parking lot updates. And so it started out with a new tenant at Slumberland, relocated to that basically eastern 2/3 of the building, and that's up and going now. And so this project is the development of the rest of the building, which is located in suites A, B, and C, basically on the west side of that building. Again, part of that developmental agreement, looking at parking lot upgrades. And as you can see kind of in that top photo, the area in the front of the building is the larger piece of parking lot. And there's a new driveway that was installed recently for the Slumberlands project, along with some parking lot islands. Up towards the northwest corner of the property, we put some divider islands in between the frontage road and the parking lot to kind of split that free flow movement, so to speak. And that was put in as part of that University Avenue project because we had to chase that Idaho road back a little bit into this development when that intersection was done at Boulder Drive. So the city put those two islands in, and then the developer will continue that down up to the northeast corner of the site. So there's going to be some additional islands in the parking lot up front, and again, that's tied back to that developmental agreement, which should be completed by the end of this year. Finally, there is an easement along the west side of the building that is part of this project, and I'll get into that a little bit here. But the idea is to, again, this is more of a facade improvement plan. This is a perspective at the corner, so that building on the left is more of the tenant suite A, so to speak, which is kind of intended for a retail commercial area. The corner building, corner suite, is identified for possible restaurant there. And then along the west side, it's another retail unit. So just kind of going into some materials that they're looking at. There's an existing ephes front on that. So basically for the majority, they're going to paint that ephes front in the front of the building. They want to add some windows along the north side, so it'd be kind of transom windows there, and then do some new cladding for the window frames. The existing ramp and stairs will remain for access to both those suites, and then they want to add some wood lock composite panels there for a possible seating area just to the east of the front door, and then that'd be topped with a metal roof. So then moving along with that corner suite there, again, creating a new look for a new entry. There's not one there now, so a new entry to that possible restaurant there, which would be kind of brought out a little bit from the existing plane of the facade for new corrugated metal panels, new signage above that, and a possible patio area up front. They identified a garage door there in front there for the seating area, so that could open up to bring that flow in from the interior to the outdoor patio area, and then corner signage on the building. Moving to the west side, again, carrying that design down through the back end of that suite B there, new windows there for the seating area, awnings, and then the back would be just, again, paint the block, existing block, new entry for the store, and then kind of keep that new canopy in mind as I move along to the next page. But down at the southeast corner of the building, southwest corner of the building, is a idea for a canopy for a drop-off on a donation site there. They plan to install an elevated ramp and sidewalk for this because basically the existing sidewalk is about 3 feet below the finished floor interior. So that's kind of one of the big concerns that the city has on that. And I want to explain the whole idea with the west side of that building. Currently there's a 30-foot easement that runs just right on the west side. And part of that easement is actually under the building, about 5-6 feet under the building. And the building was built back in the 1960s. It was placed in the wrong place. So as we develop that 2016 agreement, it calls for any change in that building facade will have to come back to review through planning and zoning. We don't want any further encroachments into that easement, and we want a way to protect those two. There's a sanitary line and there's a storm sewer line that runs underneath that. So we want to have a way to protect those two lines as any improvements are made on that west side. As I mentioned, that canopy there down at the southwest corner, the supports for those canopies are just on the outside of that easement, so it's not going to affect that. But we want to have that canopy designed in case something happens to those sewer lines that it can be easily removed from the building without getting too far into what they made those improvements with. So then moving along with the sidewalk cross-section, I put a little diagram there on the right side of the picture. So there's an existing sidewalk along the side of the building. Basically, the idea is to elevate that sidewalk on a block wall about 3 foot at a maximum. So there's going to be some ramps and sidewalks up there. And the idea is it's going to be placed over concrete, but not a full depth footing. So it shouldn't interfere with that. There's a storm sewer line, as you can see, just right off the edge of the building. It's about 4 feet deep. And so the applicant did video those two lines recently, and we had a chance to review those two lines. Both lines are in pretty good shape. So I did talk to the architect, and we want to make sure that any work above that does not interfere or damage that line anymore. So compacted fill, material, anything like that, we want to make sure that area is protected. So really it's going to be on a wall with fill material and then a sidewalk capped on top of that with a railing. So moving along with that, we want to recommend approval on this and again, enter into a supplemental or developmental agreement with that property owner there. Again, with the maintenance of the sewer line, if there's any damage to the sewer line, the city will go in and make those repairs, but then those improvements you put in, the developer puts in for the building, they will have to place those improvements back at their own expense. If there's any loss in business operations, it's their expense, any building damage or any building improvements. So we want to make sure those are covered. And we'll probably video that sewer and sanitary line once again after these projects are done, just to make sure that nothing has been damaged as part of the construction. So moving along, we just again have a plan for a canopy removal and then complete those parking lot, island, and landscaping improvements per that existing agreement. And then any technical comments we want to maintain, and then if the Planning and Zoning Commission have any comments on that.
And if our applicant would like to speak to the items?
Good evening, Commissioners. I want to start by saying thank you to Planning and Zoning and really everyone else at the city. Working with a really unusual project hurdle, which is the 30-foot easement. Normally not allowed, really not much of a discussion about building over an easement where we have lines, but really there's no other way to develop this property on a multi-front situation. And the city was willing to explore SUDAS standard construction opportunities to allow us to build non-frost footing site improvement work to allow this project to actually happen. Without this agreement in place, which the owner is well aware of and we've written a letter on their behalf, had him sign and provide it to the city, acknowledging that any future demolition or reconstruction of the site improvement over that easement is entirely the cost of the owner. He accepts that, he understands why the city's asking for that, but without that cooperation with the city, this project doesn't happen, and we still have a black EVIS facade on a third of this building. So we'll be painting that out as soon as possible. But between those two items, really the project's ready to go. They have LOIs already signed. We already have permits for the interior work, which are, of course, occupancy is contingent upon the exterior approval and work all being completed.
Any questions for Mr. Levi?
Can't tell us who's moving in there, huh? What kind of food we're going to get?
No. Not yet.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions, commissioners, for staff or other discussion?
No, I think it's a pretty exciting project to get that finished. I mean, Slumberland side of it is very nice, so it's nice to see the other side developed and finished. So I would move to approve that with the conditions the city has put forward.
Is there a second? Motion and a second. There we go. Go ahead and. We have all eyes on that item, so it is also approved, and we'll move on to City Council. And I think anytime we see a redevelopment in our agenda list, that's a good thing. Great progress on that particular site. Next agenda item, Pinnacle Ridge, second minor plat, a replat of parcels M and N. And Mr. Sturch, you're up.
Yeah, the commission may remember this one back in February. We looked at a minor plat for the Pinnacle Ridge area off of Green Hill Road and Oster Parkway. Kind of the focus was near the southwest corner of that development. In that case, the developer took those 3 lots and created 2 lots out of them. So basically, this was approved last February for the Pinnacle Ridge minor plat, because the idea was to create 2 larger lots out of the 3, because there was a couple of property owners getting ready to build on that. Well, that fell through, so they want to go back to the original idea of 3 lots. So we have to do the second edition minor plat to go back to 3 lots, and that's basically what this is all about. Is it's going to go back to the original. There'll be different numbers since it's the second edition minor plat. So we'd like to move that, recommend approval, and move that to City Council.
The applicant wish to speak to this item? Any other public comment? Any questions from the commission?
Seems pretty straightforward to me. I'd move for approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve. And we have full approval on that one, 6 ayes, and that's approved, and we'll also move on to City Council. That concludes our kind of normal new business items. Our last item on our agenda is training discussion on ex-parte communication and conflict of interest. I think this is
You want to give this to her?
Good evening. Myself situated here. My name's Christine Stone. I'm an attorney from the Allers and Cooney Law Firm in Des Moines. I have been with the firm for a little over a year, and prior to coming to Allers, I was an in-house city attorney in Bettendorf for 4 years, and prior to that, I was an assistant city attorney for the city of Ames. So thank you very much for having me this evening. The purpose of the discussion tonight is sort of to talk about the commission and your role as a commissioner, and just sort of some issues that we see come up pretty frequently, and kind of work through those with you. So please feel free to ask questions at any time. So the topics to be covered this evening are sort of the big picture and the role of the Planning and Zoning Commission and Zoning Board of Adjustment, conflicts of interest, ex parte communications, and then some court case examples that will kind of better explain what we're talking about. So the big picture, the Planning and Zoning Commission and Board of Adjustment are created by Iowa Code Chapter 414. The Iowa statutes reference the commission and the board, so they do not vest any power in individual commission or board members. It's always the body that has the power under the law to exercise its powers. And then turning to your city code, Cedar Falls identifies the powers of the Planning and Zoning Commission in section 2130 of the city code. And that code section identifies that the Planning and Zoning Commission shall have and possess the following powers and duties. And those are specifically enumerated within the code. The powers include the preparation of the comprehensive plan, any other plans that relate to the comp plan, and then any amendments to those plans. So because your land use map and zoning map is sort of tied into your comp plan, that includes any rezoning applications. The commission is also responsible for reviewing all plats and vacations of city property. And you also review all the plans for streets, parks, and other public improvements that are affecting the overall city plan. And similarly, for the Board of Adjustment, the City Code identifies the powers of the Board of Adjustment. And those include, in appropriate cases, to make special exceptions. So in a lot of codes, those are identified as special use permits, things of that nature. The Board of Adjustment also hears and decides appeals from decisions made by the Department of your zoning department staff. And it also authorizes variances where, owing to special conditions, a literal enforcement of the provisions of the chapter would result in unnecessary hardship. So variance requests is a big item that Board of Adjustment is responsible for. So what is the unnecessary hardship that is required when considering a variance request? The land in question cannot yield a reasonable return if used only for the purposes allowed in that zone. The plight of the landowner is due to unique circumstances and not to the general conditions in the neighborhood. And the use to be authorized would not alter the essential character of the locality. So it's a pretty high bar that folks need to meet when they're requesting a variance to be granted one of those. And under Iowa law, the power to grant a variance, quote, should be used sparingly and with great caution or in exceptional instances only. So again, just looking at the big picture overall, as commission members, your authority and powers come from the actions taken as part of the board or commission to which you are a member, not your actions as an individual. And this framework comes from both state and local law. Okay, turning to conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest are defined in various places. The common law, so cases that have been litigated over time within Iowa Code Chapter 362, within Iowa Code Chapter 68B, and then you also have your own city policies that identify conflicts of interest and how to respond to those. So under the common law, the Iowa Supreme Court has stated that conflict of interest rules, whether common law or statutory, are based on moral principles and public policy. They demand complete loyalty to the public and seek to avoid subjecting a public servant to the difficult and often insoluble task of deciding between public duty and private advantage. It is not necessary that the advantage be a financial one. Neither is it required that there be a showing the official sought or gained such a result. It is the potential for conflict of interest that the law desires to avoid. So even the appearance of a conflict of interest can be problematic. It is generally improper and illegal for a member of a municipal council or a similar body to vote on any question in which he or she is personally interested or where his personal rights will be affected. So this comes from a case way back in 1926. Under the common law, a conflict of interest may also be found where a policymaker has an unalterably closed mind on matters critical to the disposition of the proceeding. So policymakers are required to consider in good faith and to objectively evaluate arguments presented to them, but are not expected to be subjectively impartial. So board and commission members must therefore remain willing to consider opposing views on items which will come to them for consideration. So you shouldn't essentially make up your mind before folks have had an opportunity to present in front of you. So turning now to Iowa statutes, under Chapter 362, Iowa Code 362.5 says that a city officer shall not have an interest, direct or indirect, in any contract or job of work or material or the profits thereof or services to be furnished or performed for the officer's city. A contract entered into in violation of this section is void. This can be referred to as a self-dealing conflict. There are some exceptions within Chapter 362, and those include where contracts are publicly bid. So if the city goes through a public bidding process and you work for a company that's responding, as long as that bid was submitted publicly through that process, it would not be considered a conflict. Contracts that would predate the election or appointment of the city officer, but that contract could not be renewed then while you are an officer of the city. Contracts with a corporation in which a city officer has an interest by reason of stock holdings when they're less than 5% of the outstanding stock of the corporation, when that's yourself or your spouse or immediate family member. And then there are other exceptions, but these are sort of the most common ones that we see. Iowa Code Section 362.6 gives city officers the ability to determine whether a conflict exists for themselves, and this determination will be considered conclusive. So the responsibility is yours to determine whether you have a conflict with respect to a particular item. The board or commission's actions will not be considered invalid due to such a conflict unless that vote is decisive to the passage of the measure. So if only one member is conflicted and that was not, their vote was not critical to the passage of the item, that conflict would not be considered fatal. But remember, a contract would be considered void where the member has a prohibited interest in that contract. So regardless of whether you vote or not, if it's that self-dealing type of a conflict, that would be considered void. Okay, moving on to Chapter 68B. City officers are prohibited from engaging in any of the following conduct. The first is outside employment or activities that involve the use of the government's time or resources to give the person an advantage or benefit that is not available to the general public. The second would be outside employment or activities that involve the receipt of consideration by the government official from someone other than the government for performing work that is part of the duties and responsibilities of that person. And then outside employment or activities that are subject to the official enforcement or control of the person during the performance of their official government duties. So here are some examples of the three types of conflicts under 68B. So the first would be, for example, using your city-provided iPad to run an online retail store. So that would be using government resources to give yourself an advantage that's not available to the public. The second type would be, as an example, accepting payment from a home builder each time you recommend approval of a residential subdivision. That would be receipt of consideration from someone other than the city for performing your official duties. And then the third would be working as a residential home builder yourself within the jurisdiction where you also serve on the Zoning Board of Adjustment. Because a lot of home builders come to the Board of Adjustment for variance requests and things like that. So that would be employment that is subject to the official control of the board on which you serve. So for conflicts of the first and second type, you must immediately stop that outside employment or activity. But for the third type, you have the choice of either stopping the outside employment or activity, or you could publicly disclose the conflict and avoid taking action that would detrimentally affect or create a benefit for the outside employment or activity. Under Chapter 68B, there are certain conflicts of city officials that will extend to immediate family members. Under the law, however, an immediate family member is defined as the spouse and dependent children of a public official or public employee. So if you are prohibited from doing something, if it would be a conflict for you to do something, it would also be a conflict for your spouse or dependent children to do that. And then one additional thing to keep in mind for the Board of Adjustment specifically, there is sort of a conflict of interest provision within Chapter 414, and that says that a majority of the members of the Board of Adjustment shall be persons representing the public at large and shall not be involved in the business of purchasing or selling real estate. So that is a specific statutory limitation on the makeup of the Board of Adjustment. The City of Cedar Falls does have a conflicts policy. There is an annual declaration of compliance that is required. The city prohibits its officials from engaging in any activity, practice, or act that unlawfully conflicts with or appears to conflict with the interests of the city. So this is consistent with the Wilson versus Iowa City case, which says that it is the potential for conflict of interest that the law desires to avoid. So when in doubt, following the city policy, you should disclose the potential conflict and not take action on the matter. Okay. Does anybody have any questions so far?
I do.
Sure.
On the one where you said, it was specifically stated the zoning board of adjustments, not P&Z,
Right.
just the zoning board of
Just Board
adjustment.
of Adjustment. So
Okay.
there are some specific rules that apply to that board, just because of the types of things that they get involved with, more so than planning and zoning.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to ex-parte communications. When we talk about ex-parte communication, we're really talking about due process rights. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 14th Amendment also states that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Similarly, the Iowa Constitution contains that same language. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And due process requires fundamental fairness in a judicial proceeding, so a trial that is fundamentally unfair violates the guarantees of due process in the United States and Iowa constitutions. Looking at sort of the court system is a good way to think about due process and those requirements. The American adjudicatory system is generally premised upon the ideal that the search for truth and the wise interpretation and development of the law are best advanced through an adversarial process in which each party submits evidence and presents legal argument while simultaneously testing the evidence presented and challenging the legal arguments made by the opposing side. So again, thinking about the legal and court system, when one lawyer for one party communicates surreptitiously with a judge or a juror in a manner that may influence the outcome in the adjudication, the other party has been deprived of its due process right to be heard. and the confidence of the public in the impartiality of the tribunal may be compromised. The Iowa Supreme Court has explained that the purpose behind the rule prohibiting ex parte communications is to prevent the effect or even the appearance of granting undue advantage to one party to the litigation. So these same principles will apply to situations where a city commission or board is performing a quasi-judicial function. A quasi-judicial function is found where the activity involves proceedings in which notice and an opportunity to be heard are required, or where a determination of rights of parties is made, which requires the exercise of discretion in finding facts and applying the law thereto. And some examples of quasi-judicial proceedings would be rezonings and other land use matters, variance requests, and then any and all administrative appeals that would come before the city council or a board or commission. At a minimum, due process requires that quasi-judicial proceedings involve notice, an opportunity to be heard, and an impartial decision maker. Ex parte communications can lead to one party being heard more than the other, and or can lead to an impartial decision maker, both of which would violate the due process rights of the parties to the dispute. There is some guidance that was prepared by the Cedar Falls City Attorney back in 2007, and that is an excellent summary of these concerns and issues. Ex parte communications should be avoided in quasi-judicial proceedings, and if they occur, they should be publicly disclosed to give the parties an opportunity to respond or object. So if you are contacted by one party to a rezoning or something like that, someone who's opposed to it or in favor of it, you should really disclose that communication during the public hearing and say, you know, name, contacted me on this date, this was what they discussed. But I informed them, you know, that I haven't made up my mind and that there would be a public hearing and encourage them to attend.
So, yeah, so what you're saying is anytime you know, sometimes you get these things and you'll get a few calls. So what you're
Right.
saying is you should document those and disclose them.
I mean, the best practice would be come to the public hearing. It's not really appropriate for me to talk to you
Right.
outside of that setting, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
Right.
So where it does occur.
Right, so if they call you and say, hey, you know, I've got whatever, and say, well, it's going to be such and such, and come on down, and
Right.
that you don't really need to disclose that if you're not really talking
No,
about that.
that wouldn't be an issue, but it would be if you
But
had a
if they're throwing
conversation.
out their thoughts to you, you know, and
Right, these are the specific concerns that this person raised when I spoke with them on this. Yeah, that type of communication should be disclosed. So talking about a few cases that will hopefully put some of this in a little bit more perspective. This first case is a Board of Adjustment case from 1993. Bluffs Development applied to the Board of Adjustment for a conditional use permit to develop a recycling plant and landfill in Pottawatomie County. The development company alleged that there were conflicts of interest among the board members, which meant that their actions to deny the permit were illegal. And some of those allegations were, you know, one of the Board of Adjustment members was an insurance salesman, and they said, well, he deals with all these people in town, and he's hearing all this stuff from his clients, so he's already made up his mind. So they were those sorts of allegations, just about community members and what they would be hearing outside of the public hearing. In the case, the court said that officials exercising quasi-judicial powers are disqualified or incompetent to sit in a proceeding in which they have prejudged the case or in which they have a personal or pecuniary interest, where they are related to an interested person within the degree prohibited by statute, or where they are biased, prejudiced, or labor under a personal ill will toward a party. So those would be the circumstances in which a conflict would be found. The court also said that a disqualifying conflict of interest must be direct, definite, capable of demonstration, not remote, uncertain, contingent, unsubstantial, or merely speculative or theoretical. So the court found that, just because you're an insurance salesman in the community where this is happening, that does not lead to a conflict of interest. And they determined that there weren't any direct identifiable conflicts that the applicant could demonstrate. The court said that Potawatomi County, while a sizable community, will inevitably have members of administrative committees which have some social relationship with most applicants or opponents to administrative actions. Such a relationship does not rise to automatic disqualification. So again, it has to be something you can identify and articulate as a specific conflict. This is not a land use case. This is actually a mayoral removal case that came up in district court in 2017. This is Broderson versus the City of Muscatine. But this case does do a good job of explaining sort of due process and fundamental fairness. So in this case, the mayor of Muscatine was removed based on claims of willful misconduct and/or maladministration and willful or habitual neglect or refusal to perform duties of office under the Muscatine City Code. Her removal hearing was held before the City Council, and the mayor argued at the hearing as well as afterwards that it did not provide adequate due process to her. And the court agreed. The court concluded that the city violated the mayor's right to due process in two ways. First of all, by intermingling the investigatory, prosecutorial, and adjudicative functions during the removal process, and second, by having an interest in the outcome of the removal proceeding. The court said that due process requires a fair trial before a fair tribunal, not simply the empty appearance of fairness. Upon review of the record in the case and based on the totality of the circumstances, the court reaches the inescapable conclusion that the City Council impermissibly intermingled investigative, prosecutorial, and adjudicative functions which rendered the mayor's removal proceedings fundamentally unfair and thus violated her due process rights. When the council made the decision to remove the mayor from office, the council members had a strong interest in shielding themselves from potential liability, in preventing the council from being the focus of further accusations, and in restoring its image in the community while negatively impacting the mayor's image. Thus, the City Council had a personal interest in the proceedings at the time it removed the mayor from office, which rendered the removal proceedings fundamentally unfair. And at this time, I'd open it up for any questions or comments, or anybody has anything additional? I know you had a regular meeting before this, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. Have a good evening.
We do have a couple Board of Adjustment members here present, and glad they showed up.
Thank you. That concludes our agenda items. At this point, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor of adjournment signify with aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Thank you. We are adjourned.